All right, soul family. So we're going to talk about how many individuals of previous generations, way before Generation Z, have been sabotaging freedom just because chaos is so familiar to them during slavery. Now, a lot of previous generations, that's like, Generation X people that grew up in the Western countries, for example, they have these Generation Z children and have their Generation Z children, grow up in places where the Generation X people in the Western countries have suffered in so much chaos where it had to do with sexism, colorism, or racism. And that's not fair to no Generation Z children. That's not fair to them, man, because look, whatever happened with Generation X people in the Western countries during the 1960s, 1970s, bro, that should not be applying to Generation Z individuals. You feel me? Because if anybody was going to have children, the whole point of having children is for them to grow up in places where they have true freedom and they have more opportunities that they was not going to get in a place that was full of chaos, right? That's the whole point. And the children that's birthed, they're supposed to like share their spiritual intelligent powers, their spiritual talents, and be able to shine, and that should be able to be around spiritual family that actually celebrates them, right? Because a lot of Generation Z people, due to a lot of Generation Z spiritual beings that's been growing up in these places that's considered chaotic, they have been missing out on their child years and teenage years, not being able to have spiritual family that will celebrate them for being spiritually intelligent, being celebrated to be able to think for themselves, thinking outside the box, not being closed mind into a soulless vibrational matrix. A lot of spiritually awake Generation Z people have always yearned and been searching for spiritual family. We know this, especially in the eras of TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, and all these other type of social media platforms, right? We know this. So it's like, it hurts for me to see a lot of Generation Z people that are spiritually awake, speak on their experiences of growing up in places that are considered chaotic and energy draining, growing up in the same energy draining places that their Generation X parents had grew up at. It's very hurtful to hear these stories on social media, right? Because it's like, why would their Generation X parents do this? When people have not healed, and go for better, they always have their children go through the same thing. And that's not the smart thing to do. You feel me? That's not the smart thing to do, especially with Generation Z people. That actually messes with us Generation Z people heavy to the max, So it's like for example, right? Let's say a Generation X person that was like European nationality, or the nationalities of melanated people had grew up in Mississippi or Louisiana and during the times of where Generation X was birthed, right? And then these Generation X people that grew up in Mississippi or Louisiana, right? They have their Generation Z children grow up in Mississippi and Louisiana, right? And these Generation Z children are spiritually awake beings. They think for themselves, right? Their spiritual intelligence level is like above septillion. It's godly. It's above godly tier. It's like angelic, right? So like, Generation X parents that grew up in chaotic environments of soulless vibrational people and soulless vibrational systems in Mississippi and Louisiana, and their Generation Z children they're not like enjoying themselves and having their full potential to be awakened in a soulless vibrational place like Louisiana or Mississippi, just because the Generation X parents have not healed from situations to go for better that's way better than the chaotic places in Mississippi and Louisiana has ever had to offer in existence, right? Places that's filled with colorism, racism, and sexism, feminists always destroying men, places that have so many places that's known to have feminists that destroy cosmic vibrational men, and vice versa. Like that's not a place for any individual to be growing up at. It literally slows down their spiritual growth, like for real. So like, just because a place is familiar and it's chaotic, and you just go for what's chaotic, that's not a healthy thing to do, because so many individuals do this, right? And I'm gonna end it with this. Like individuals, especially parents from the Generation X generation that grew up in these Western countries like United Kingdom, Canada, and USA, for example, you know, they've been so used to chaotic places, right? So they'll have their Generation Z children grow up in these chaotic locations, just because the Generation S people have not healed, and they have not, you know, they chose not to go for better because they didn't want better for themselves. So they just like have the children have a harder path to be far away from spiritual family that will actually celebrate them, right? Because this is all part of spiritual warfare, man. This is why spiritual warfare has been existing, for one of those reasons, because a lot of Generation X parents have literally had their Generation Z children like grow up in places that's like very chaotic, man. And just because the Generation X people grow up in a chaotic environment, bro, that does not mean that the Generation Z people are supposed to grow up in the same places. Because I'm going to tell you right now, a lot of Generation Z children that's like spiritually awake, they not supposed to be in places like Mississippi and Louisiana. I'm going to tell you that right now. They're not supposed to be there. You know, if anybody that has the update on Mississippi and Louisiana, it's literally a trash hellhole out in those locations. Literally. It's not a place for no spiritually awake people. Like, for real. If you're looking for people that be like peace to the gods and goddesses, you're not going to find them in Louisiana and Mississippi. You're not going to find them. So, like, it's crazy, man. Like, you know what they say. You know what they say about individuals who go back to places that's familiar, right? The places that seem familiar is always chaotic. It's always chaotic, right? People be so comfortable. Most individuals who have not healed, they always be so comfortable going back to places that's familiar to them, but it's always chaotic for their children's growth. The same way it was chaotic for them when they were children, right? You know, I never understood that, right? Because the same people, the same parents who would go back to a place that's like very familiar, even if it was chaotic, they're the same people who run back to their toxic ex. That don't make no sense to me. That don't make no sense. Why would you go back to a toxic ex when the new person is better? Like, if I was to go to a new location right now, I know it's better than where I left. That was so chaotic for me. I would never go back to a place that caused me damn stress, caused me damn energy draining days. Like, I would never do that shit. You know what I'm saying? Because this is one thing us Generation Z people have figured out. Like, we don't go back to things that's chaotic. If it's been chaotic, we leave that shit. Because we not a part of Generation X, man. We wish Generation X people in the Western countries knew this. But the Generation X people that grew up in these countries far away from the Western lands, they know to not mess with anything that's chaotic. They just leave it. So shout out to the Generation X people that grew up in those Eastern countries far away from the Western lands, and they're spiritually awake. Like, shout out to them. But like, man, it's not a good look at all. It's not a good look at all for Generation X parents that have their children grow up in places that the Generation X parents were familiar with. Even if the familiar place is chaotic and literally has a toll on their Generation Z children, to not be around their spiritual family in these more healthier, newer locations, right? Because the places that's not familiar to us is always better for us spiritually awake people. The places that's familiar is always chaotic, man. That's all I'm gonna say.